Oh, I'd be happy to. Well, space exploration was seen as another dramatic arena for Cold War competition. On October 4th, 1957, a Soviet R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile launched. Oh, it's just the missile that was used to send Sputnik into orbit around the Earth. It was the first Soviet satellite to be launched into space. In fact, it was the first satellite ever to be in space. Now, back to what I was saying. Sputnik's launch came as an unpleasant surprise to most Americans. In the United States, space was seen as the next frontier of exploration, and it was crucial not to lose too much ground on the Soviets. Well, America wasn't far behind the Soviets. In 1958, the U.S. launched its own satellite, Explorer 1, designed by the U.S. Army under the direction of rocket scientist Werner von Braun. That same year, President Dwight Eisenhower signed a public order creating the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, a federal agency dedicated to space exploration. Exactly. Eisenhower also created two national security-oriented space programs that would operate simultaneously with NASA's program. The first, headed up by the U.S. Air Force, dedicated itself to exploiting the military potential of space. The second, led by the Central Intelligence Agency, the Air Force, and a new organization called the National Reconnaissance Office, was codenamed Corona. It would use orbiting satellites to gather intelligence on the Soviet Union and its allies. Great question. Well, in 1959, the Soviet space program took another step forward with the launch of Luna 2, the first space probe to hit the moon. Be patient, because just 2 years later, the Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first person to orbit Earth, traveling in the capsule-like spacecraft Vostok 1. For the U.S. effort to send a man into space, dubbed Project Mercury, NASA engineers designed a smaller cone-shaped capsule far lighter than Vostok. They tested the craft with chimpanzees and held a final test flight in March 1961 before the Soviets were able to pull ahead with Gagarin's launch. On May 5th, astronaut Alan Shepard became the first American in space. Later that May, President John F. Kennedy made the bold claim that the U.S. would land a man on the moon before the end of the decade. In February 1962, John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth. And by the end of that year, the foundations of NASA's lunar landing program, dubbed Project Apollo, were in place. Yep, they were given numbers to tell them apart. Well, a lot of the ones in between were either unmanned tests or they were sent to orbit the moon. December 1968 was the launch of Apollo 8, the first manned space mission to orbit the moon, from NASA's massive launch facility on Mare Island near Cape Canaveral, Florida. On July 16, 1969, U.S. astronauts Neil Armstrong, Edwin "Buzz" Aldrin, and Michael Collins set off on the Apollo 11 space mission, the first lunar landing attempt. After landing successfully on July 20th, Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon's surface. He famously called the moment "one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Yeah, and by landing on the moon, the United States effectively won the space race that had begun with Sputnik's launch in 1957. That's a great question. I think there are some breakthroughs that the U.S. has had regarding this topic. I believe that in the near future we will have put humans on Mars and maybe even send manned spacecrafts farther than we have before. These are all things that I hope for, but the U.S. is going to need to find money to fund this. In the beginning, I think their motives were almost identical. They knew that if they could get men or cameras into space, they could spy on their enemies that way. And I think once they got their own satellites into space, they just kept going just to prove who was better. No problem. Thanks for having me.